For our next project, we're going to be making a sock. It has a vertical stripe pattern in the cuff, and I will also be showing you how to make the heel. So let's begin. For this project, we're going to be using the 24 peg loom. Now the pattern has 2 rows of gold, 2 rows of red. So we'll be wrapping 2 pegs with gold, 2 pegs with red before the pattern repeats. So we have a 4 peg pattern. The total number of pegs in your loom needs to be divisible by 4. If it's not, then you'll need to adjust your pattern. For example, if you have a 22 peg loom, then just do every other peg, and that will be a 2 peg pattern. So let's get started. We're going to be using 2 colors at the same time. So we will start with our gold, and we'll tie a slip knot. And we'll put our first color on our first peg. Now, because we are going to be skipping pegs in our pattern, you need to have more tension on your yarn or the cuff will be very loose. This is peg number 1, and so there's our second wrap of gold. We're going to skip these 2 pegs for our red and start our gold here. And then wrap the second one, skip the next 2 pegs, wrap the next one and the second one, skip the next 2, wrap the next 2, skip the next, wrap, skip, wrap, and then here's our last 2 red. So we'll take this and wrap it around our holding peg. Now we'll start the red. So we'll tie our slip knot. And this is our starting peg for our red. So we'll slip it on. And then this is peg number 1 for our red. We'll wrap the next one. Now this is easier because you know which ones are already wrapped and which ones you need to wrap. So then we'll go here and here. These 2, these 2, and the last 2. Now, we're going to start wrapping our gold again, so we'll take this one off and hold it tight or else it'll come loose. And then we'll wrap here. Okay, so now we have our gold. Remember to push your yarn down. Okay. So now we're going to wrap our gold for our second row. And then we're going to trade. So here's our red. Hold it tight so it doesn't come loose. Now we'll go around and do a second row of red. And remember to keep your tension tight. It may seem a little tight, but once you start doing the picking, you'll notice that it really loosens up. So let's put the red on. We'll push our yarn down, and then we'll start the gold. Okay, so now we're going to start the gold again. And then here's our last row of the red, and then we can start picking. Now we'll be picking in the same way we have done in all the other projects. The bottom row up over the top two. And you don't need to skip colors, just go right across all the way around. Now for the cuff of the sock, we need a total of 30 rows. So this is our first 3. Getting started is the hardest part. Once you have it going, it's a lot easier. So continue this pattern until you have 30 rows, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so I'm just finishing up the 30th row. Now we will make our cuff. It's the same with a brim. Pull the inside up through the middle. Now this may look a little confusing, but don't worry, it's not that bad. And here is our starting peg. So follow the line down, and you have all these big loops down at the bottom. This loop is our first loop that we want to bring up over to the top. So there's our first one. So if you can see here, this is our first row of gold, this is our second. So here is our second gold loop. And then we have our first red row. So here's our first row of red. Here's the second row. So there's the second loop. Now if you can see here, this gold loop right here is actually the same loop for our next set of gold. Okay, so we have one loop on 2 pegs. And then we have our second row of gold. So here's our loop. And then same thing with the red. Here's our red loop right here. So this is the one that we're using right here for our second loop of red. And then here we have our another one. Here's our gold. Here's the other gold. And then the red. And the red. So here's our next loop of gold. There. And then here's the one on the red, so we're going to pull this one over onto our red loop. There's the other one. And then here's our gold. Here's the other gold. And then here's our red one. And red. And then here's our other gold one. And then the red. gold. And then here's the one that matches up for our other gold, right there. And then here's our red. And then here, right here, is our other red. So just to make sure that you have your rows lined up, so here we have our 2 rows of gold, and then we look, and then there's our 2 rows of gold. And then our red, so just make sure that all of your rows are lined up with the pegs. So now we will pick bottom up over the top. Okay, there you go. We've just completed the cuff. Now we're going to do 10 rows for the ankle portion of our sock. But first we need to tie off our red thread. So we'll undo that. We'll cut off about 2 inches of thread. We'll bring this into the center and the end of our red yarn, and we're just going to tie a square knot. Now we'll cut off the ends. Now that we've done our cuff, we're going to push the yarn down our pegs so that we can begin the ankle portion of our sock. So we're going to skip these 2 pegs and come over to peg number 1 and wrap every peg all the way around the loom. You'll need to wrap and pick 10 rows for the ankle portion of your sock, and then we can do the heel. All right, I'm just finishing up the 10th row, and now we can begin the heel. So let's push these down. So I'm going to do the heel in red. So we'll start with a slip knot, and we're going to start on peg number 1. So we'll put that on the first peg. And now we're going to wrap the first 10 pegs. This is your first peg, so that's 1. There's 10. Now we're just going to hold this while we pick these 10 pegs. Okay, push those down. Now we're going to go back and wrap the same 10 pegs. So we're going to take our yarn and make sure that you have a 3rd loop. So we're going to wrap there 1, and then we're going to come around and wrap 2. So we're going in the opposite direction on the same 10 pegs. Now we'll just hold this over here and pick those 10 rows. Okay, push those down. Now we're going to decrease 1 peg on each end. So now we're only going to wrap 8 pegs. So we're going to skip this first peg and wrap this peg. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we're not going to wrap this peg. So just hold that there, and now we're going to pick these 8 pegs. Now we'll go back, wrap the same 8 pegs. So make sure you get a wrap on that last peg, and then we'll wrap back the same 8. So we're not going to wrap this last peg. Now you might notice a pattern. We're going to decrease a peg on each side until we get down to 2 pegs. And then on the way back, we're going to increase a peg on each side till we get back to the original 10. And that will give us the shape for our heel. Okay, so now we're not going to wrap these last 2, we're going to start on this one. We're going to wrap 6 pegs. So there we have the last 2 pegs that we haven't wrapped. We're going to pick these 6 pegs. Now we're going to wrap the same 6 pegs on the way back. So there's 1. And we left the last 2 pegs open. And then we'll go down to 4, and then 2, and then we'll increase all the way back up to the 10 original pegs. So we're skipping these 3, we're wrapping this one. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're wrapping the same 4 pegs on the way back. Now we're wrapping just the 2 middle ones. And now we're going to increase. So we've just wrapped these 2 pegs. Now we're going to move to this one and wrap 4. So we're going to come around. There's our first or our third loop. And there's 2, 3, and 4. Now we're wrapping the same 4 pegs on the way back. Now we're going to increase to 6. So we'll wrap this one. And there's 6. We'll wrap it back. Now we'll go to 8. And wrap back. Now we'll wrap the original 10 pegs. And wrap back. And there you've just completed the heel for your slipper. That was the hardest part. The rest is going to be easy. So here's the end of your yarn. Here's the beginning, and we'll just tie a square knot to hold those together. So we'll cut it off, and we'll just tie a knot. All right, so the next section of the sock is this section right here. And it's the same idea in measuring as with the slipper. On your foot, you're going to measure from the back of your heel to the front of your toe and take off 1 inch for the heel and 1 inch for the toe. So if you have a 9-inch foot, you're going to take off 1 inch for the heel and 1 inch for the toe, so that will be 7 inches of knitting for the main part of the sock. So with the 6 stitches per inch, you're going to knit 42 rows. So for this sock, I'm going to knit 26. So for whatever measurements you have, that's how many rows you're going to need, and then we'll finish off the toe. So I'm going to take my yarn and wrap all the way around the loom, just as we have done with every other project, and you'll just knit and pick the same way for the rest of the sock. All right, I've just finished the main part of my sock, and now we're going to do the toe. So let's get our red back out, and we're going to switch colors. So cut off the gold, and we'll tie the red on. All right, now for the toe, we are going to do 10 rows, and then we're going to finish it off just like we would a hat. Okay, now we're going to cut off a piece of yarn so we can gather our toe. We'll thread it through a yarn needle. All right, now we'll just take off each row onto the yarn needle. Okay, now we're going to turn this inside out. And tie it off in a square knot. Cinch it closed. Now just tie it off. Cut off the ends, and we'll cut off any remaining ends. Okay, looks good. So now just repeat the process and you'll have a pair of nice warm slipper socks. So congratulations! You've now completed a hat, a scarf, slippers, and socks. With the skills that you have learned, you should now be able to complete any project. So congratulations and happy knitting!